Kia ora koutou katoa, ko John Reid Takoinga. Welcome to this edition of Water New Zealand's podcast series, Tāwara o Te Wai. I'm John Reid from Water New Zealand. Today we're going to talk about recovery in the Hawke's Bay, 18 months or so on from Cyclone Gabrielle. This was devastating for parts of the region, and the water infrastructure was severely impacted. To discuss this, we're joined by Craig Thew from Hastings District Council and Darren de Klerk from Beca, who's been leading the Silt Taskforce. And of course, as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Hannah Edmond. Kia ora, Craig, Darren and Hannah.
Kia ora, John.
Thanks for joining us today. Really looking forward to hearing more about the recovery and some ideas about how we can be more resilient in the future. So, Hannah, over to you.
Thanks, John. Morning, Craig and Darren. It's great to have you here and to hear about the journey that you've been on over the past 18 months. Can you maybe give us a quick reminder about what actually happened during the cyclone around the Hawke's Bay area?
Well, pretty much hell come to town that weekend of February, that day in February. And it came to town on a district and a region that was already really wet from quite a wet year before. And the effects of the Auckland floods had created quite a lot of dampness and issues in the surrounds. We went to bed seeing high forecasts, talking to our governors and the level of preparedness for an event that was still going to be large, but woke up to an event that was significantly larger with effects that were well beyond those that were forecast. What that played through to doing is we woke up to a district, and through that first day after is significant amount of people completely cut off and unable to connect to each other, connect to, from a council perspective and a utility service, unable to access sites. So we had water treatment sites up into smaller communities, and there was zero opportunities to access four-wheel drive over farms, just with things like Esk Valley completely underwater with high flows. Even just over the back of Napier from where I live, a community of Puketapu, completely cut off and able to access. So we woke up to a region that still had communications in the morning, lost power fairly early in that first morning when the substation went under. So it was quite a lot to catch through, and the day degraded pretty quickly in terms of access to elements. When those stop banks breached, that saw massive inundation that went through the wider Heretaunga Plains, devastated through Ahuriri, Napier, and the wastewater treatment plant was completely inundated with the silt and the high flows that flowed through there. Thankfully, the Hastings wastewater treatment plant, the rivers decided not to breach on that side of the river, and so that kept that plant operational. Our water supply to our Esk and Whirinaki supply here in that we run, a containerised supply had just been completed, built above the 1 in 100, was completely buried with water and debris up and over the top of the containerised building. So it was pretty much mayhem, and the key was actually finding out how much mayhem we had, because the inability to access was good while we still had comms and so forth, but quite a lot of finding out what was going on early in that first day.
I'll just chip in with the southern view. So where I live in Havelock North, and for me it was, like Craig says, just the sheer event, I guess, and the fact that almost a bit of a Swiss cheese, that everything that could go kind of wrong went wrong in respect of comms as well as being cut off. So I spent the first 3 weeks south in Central Hawke's Bay, so our southernmost council, where they experienced similar issues, not as much silt, but certainly water. So their water treatment plant in Waipawa and Waipukaro significantly impacted, as well as wastewater plants where pretty much the river had joined some of the oxidation ponds in places. And you've got water treatment plant. There's some photos of kind of the water level up to the feet on the buildings. And I think ending up with 4 water notices for about 4 weeks in Waipawa's case in particular. So I guess just showing the sheer scale from kind of north to south.
Absolutely. And I guess it's not something I imagine any of you had fully dreamed that you would be seeing in your career, or that soon in your career.
It's interesting that in a previous conversation I've had at a conference is in a message. Oftentimes when you do exercises, and exercises are really good to run through and how do these systems work, but I don't think our imagination goes to all those things getting really, really big. So I guess one of the key messages is come up with what you think a really bad scenario was and then double it. Because when your systems truly get stressed, and I can reflect back on doing exercise, oh, that won't happen when that happens. Well, it can, and it's easier to prepare when all of those, some of the things that you think are available become unavailable. So we're quite an optimistic nation in some respects. So think of a really bad thing and then make it worse and then work that exercise up.
Did some of those exercises help? How did that help you sort of prepare for the emergency situation, and then thinking about sort of some of the impacts over that were extended over the long term?
Exercises are great, but unfortunately, when you also have other real events but smaller, I think they're the ones where you really learn. But the exercises are good. In events of this size and in communities, relationships are really, really critical to getting a fast turnaround, fast understanding, and cutting through what would be BAU time and process. One of the things I'd reflect on, and from our perspective, is our governors at a high level of trust and understanding, and so they gave a huge amount of delegation just to get on and fix stuff. All they wanted was updates what we were doing, but there wasn't a lot of process check-ins and approvals. It was do whatever you have to do, reconnect our communities, get the water going, keep it as stable as possible. We'll worry about the other elements later. So that's highly enabling for staff. And so that comes with building rapport and relationships in the BAU work, but just around making sure you've got some of those business continuity plans tested and worked up. I guess a frustrating one in this event, it had been talked about at a Lifelines maybe 12, 15 years ago. And while I was assisting Napier, with Napier being completely ring fenced with no transport in and out, similar to Whitehall, what we ran into problems really fast with no electricity, managed to get generators, enough generators with the leads that are the right size. When you're doing your generator planning, don't forget about your leads. Was actually access to fuel. And the situation we had in Napier, we were burning thousands of litres of diesel for emergency services, for key plant, but the generators that were running important stormwater pumps, running the water pumps to pump water into the network. We had massive amount of fuel sitting at the port, but the port didn't have a generator to get the fuel out. That had been discussed years ago in a Lifeline session. Nothing had been done. That now exists, and it sort of goes through a reflection around how do we make sure key overlapping needs of each other can be followed through with. So we were pretty tight on fuel for some days to keep the floodwaters down and keep the water flowing and keep wastewater pumping. People talk about fuel plans, people talk about having generator plans, but it's also making sure that you can actually get the raw product into the area and worked around. So working those scenarios, I think leveraging into peers and the relationships around the country is really, really important. So shared understanding and leveraging the assistance that's used, but being also cautious not to take too much assistance before you're ready for it, because it also creates some distraction around managing the support. It's great to have the support, but you have to be able to use it appropriately rather than it being a distraction.
Yeah, I think relationships are key, and probably just picking on Craig's point there, what we saw was, the partners that and the relationships you form either with your contracting partners or your supply chain in general becomes really, really important in an event like this, as well as community, obviously. So being able to use them and get them doing some extraordinary things, or reflect on some of the work around getting plants back up and running, and just the 24/7 shift and leaning into other neighbours for spare parts, etc. There was plenty of that going on. I guess just reflecting on the being ready for help as well, because it can be quite a burden on your team to, task and give jobs to those that want to come in and help as well. So it's really getting the balance right of, and you can do all the planning in the world, but it never quite lands in exactly the scenario that you have planned for. So it's an interesting reflection. You need to plan, and in Central Hawke's Bay's case, they had a couple of previous events around a big water main was damaged, and that resulted in having to plan for water tankers and boil water notices, etc. So they were able to kind of reignite those plans pretty quickly to help that community and know where to position them. And they had some trial and error, I guess, recently. Yeah.
It's like the ultimate of delegation, isn't it? The big challenge when you're delegating in under pressure and time and within all of the other things that are going on. And we all know how hard it is in day-to-day delegating out things.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Hannah, as well. As I was lucky enough by doing those exercises, so I ended up helping supporting Napier for a week, and what enabled me to do that is just confidence that each of my teams looking after the transport and Three Waters had it under control. So it was more just a scan through key issues and a check-in, which enabled me to help my colleagues in Napier, which is where I was living and stuck on the wrong side of the river as well. And you need to plan for critical people not being accessible, be it whether they're directly affected and need to deal with home because their lives have been ripped apart or potentially lost family, or be it that they just cannot get to where they need to get to. And yes, you can chopper people across, but access to choppers in these events get really, really important. And you would have all seen the footage. And the most important things choppers needed to do in that first day or two was airlift people to safety, not move engineering staff around so they could do their work. Working from home completely failed when you have no communications and no cell phone elements. So actually having teams that can survive not just on 2 or 3 really critical people. I mean, those people are always valuable, but actually stress testing and helping build trust and confidence in the individuals to make those calls, and they'll be supported on the call. Because oftentimes the worst decision is indecision in these elements. One of the ones when I stepped in to help Napier out was also giving teams just clarity of what their mission for each, like breaking it down into a morning and then a day and then what tomorrow's day will be, because these things are pretty overwhelming if you try and look at it. And so just giving mission targets for the day and really, really simple things just to focus priorities. You can get calls and requests for all sorts of things, which are interesting, but not necessarily the most critical thing at the time.
That's really covering that immediate response, isn't it? Like when that first bit comes. And I guess the big question then is kind of how does it work over the next few months?
I guess just in civil defence terms, we call it response and recovery. So response is the first kind of, the immediate time, which is probably what Craig's covered quite extensively there, whereas recovery is kind of once you've kind of got that immediate kind of needs and everyone's safe and infrastructure's safe, people are safe, and 3 Ps. Then you essentially move into what the recovery plans are, and we're still very deep into recovery at the moment and will be for some time. So again, maybe Craig can elaborate on the kind of the priorities that work through the recovery phase, and obviously there's just in our case numerous pieces of infrastructure that are damaged, and how do you prioritize what their medium to long term outlooks are.
I think, as Darren, as you said, we're still in recovery in many respects, but that response phase was just about making people safe and reconnecting people one way or another, be that reconnecting it with a transport link so they could access doctors, access work, and reconnecting our service communities that they actually have a drinking water supply that they can drink, that they don't need to boil. Response was getting them water that they could boil and wash down, and a wastewater system that doesn't need to have a whole pile of overflows into streams and so forth. So stepping into that recovery, which Darren's right, we're still in. A lot of good work carried on and momentum. One of the pieces to manage was just to try and take the sprint out of it and start to see the ultra marathon ahead, because to Darren's earlier point, it's really easy to get tired and broken by trying to sprint for many years ahead. If I talk through, for example, on the Hastings side, one of our treatment plants that we had in Esk Valley, that's all operating now. It's probably running at 80 to 90%, and we'll leave it there while we work through what is the future of that community. And Darren and his team are doing some great work in re-leveling that valley and moving silt all around. We're removing properties from our category 3 for those who wish to leave. And then we'll get into the future rebuild process. So we're sort of, the response for that was enough to hold it until we can make a permanent decision for that facility, and whether it stays where it is and gets lifted or whether it gets moved completely elsewhere. We're really waiting to see who is the service community, what is the service community, so therefore what is the long-term need. Napier went through and have been going through a significant program with their wastewater treatment plant, and that was a stage process of, first of all, getting they were lucky enough to have some driving head that enabled the flow to keep going out their outfall. It just couldn't cope with high flows, so they had overflows that enabled it to go into streams. They got their outfall pumps going, they got their screens going so they could at least screen it, and then the last stage of the process was to add the biological trickling filters to add additional treatment. But it was around base functionality, a little bit more tidying up before you get to actually ultimately back to the plants operating at its desired state. And I think that prioritisation approach is a key one across all of those elements, and it's a similar vein we've had to work through in transport, which for us is our larger issue, is reconnecting communities and workers back to the sites. So from a Three Waters, we're in a stable position up and down the region now, particularly also with the regional council's work to get the stock banks back to their pre-cyclone, filling the holes that got eaten up, because there was a fair amount of stress and anxiety from the wider community and from the infrastructure providers, getting those gaps plugged to get back to at least a base service level from a river flood threat.
I think the interesting reflection that I've got around some of that is what the cyclone did bring, though, is it really brought some uncertainty around decision making. So when Craig talks about, the Whirinaki or Esk water treatment plant, there's so many variables at the moment around what you do next. So whether that be the community that this plant serves, or whether you leave the plant in its existing location after what happened, or you relocate it. But how do you make some of those decisions, because there's so many other variables with other, say the road proposed to be lifted through the Esk Valley, or a stop bank proposed in Whirinaki, what the future of the rail is, etc. And that plays out across our communities. You've got the same thing with the wastewater plant in Napier around, do we leave the control room on the bottom floor, or given that it was completely wiped out in the cyclone, but there's a stop bank that's proposed to protect it, do we rely on that, or do we lift it as part of our resilience planning? So there's a lot of work going on around that resilience kind of planning at the moment, and obviously not just in the water space. We know that the Transpower are doing a lot of work around the substation that supplies, and was one of the big talking points through the cyclone around it being inundated, and then obviously creating such an impact across our region. But yeah, I guess it's quite interesting knowing what we know now. That just would we still make the decisions we'd made 20, 30, 50 years ago, and we have to make into the future.
It's bang on, Darren, and I think the key, I guess, to sum it up, it's in that response or partial recovery, it's just creating a stable holding pattern, so you don't rush to the rebuild and lock yourself into this once in a multiple generation, hopefully, decision point to do the right thing. But that does take time, because we do need to work through quite a few pieces of uncertainty with what's the future flood control, what happens with some of the land use, and where will people go back to, and where won't they go back to. So in that early response and partial recovery, is if you can create a stable holding pattern to then do the rebuild in a structured, planned, and in a coherent way. Otherwise, you're either going to undercook it and miss it and have to come back, or you'll overdo it and overbuild for something that actually ultimately isn't necessary.
So the location where we build our infrastructure, we've just been touching on that, is really important. Is anything differently you do next time, and how can we make things sort of more resilient in the future? When we're thinking about this and more broadly across New Zealand.
Yeah, I might just maybe I'll jump in a little bit around some of the thinking that we've been doing as I guess advisors to a lot of the councils and some of their kind of future plans, and obviously the ability to be adaptive to some form. So having a think about when you're thinking about resilience, it's the ability for that infrastructure to adapt to things that change. we can obviously get caught up in trying to design to certain design levels, but what we're seeing is they're changing a lot. The cyclone in particular completely shifted what is a 1 in 100-year event, which is your typical design standards. So, how do we do that? How do we be adaptive so that if things fail, how do they fail safely? And we think about how we can put them back together as quickly as possible through that response phase. So I think there's a lot of that going on because it's pretty hard to move some well-set infrastructure. So how do you kind of build resilience into the system so you're not reliant on a kind of single point of failure? I think that's probably one of the key reflections on my part, is actually just rather than thinking about, one key asset supplying a community, how do you maybe decentralize a little bit of that, or how do you allow the community in itself? We think about some of the roads in particular. Back in the day, you had Ford type crossings, in rural communities. Actually, that's rather than rebuilding a bridge that may get washed out in the next event, actually having something that maybe fails a few times a year, but that community knows how they can respond and they accept that level of service that they know. So I think it's probably thinking about laterally and how we plan moving forward.
Yeah, the resilience is what's that maximum allowable outage and how fast can you recover? Because we're not going to be able to harden our defences to anything and everything. There's always going to be the thing that usurps what we've designed for. I think it would be useful just in that space, though, with a little bit more national direction around what would be general expectations for critical infrastructure. It helps potentially lessen time that authorities may be putting their mind to it, but also provides a context in which an economic regulator or governance in a community is assessing what comes up and what's cropping up now is gold plating. And so communities and funders forget very quickly the catastrophe of loss of control is. And so I think a degree of what can New Zealand Inc. afford and what is New Zealand Inc. risk assessment. I think the challenge with some of the services that we do provide, and particularly in Three Waters, is we still have communities in harm's way, and they're going to be in harm's way until one way Mother Nature takes them out or decisions to retreat from harm's way happen. And those are really difficult political, economic, and social decisions to be laid to. So we are going to have to carry on servicing communities in some pretty awkward situations. So it is around how can we have a plan that can deliver as best we can, but how do we make a community aware of what the risks that they're buying into and their expectations around how they need to be able to cope in that. So I don't think in New Zealand we have a community that's has been particularly well informed of the risks that exists, particularly in the new areas. I think there's a massive opportunity moving forward from a national policy section and then supporting it through regional and local. Is when someone buys into an area, they truly pay attention, like happens in other countries, to what those risks that they're putting themselves exposed to. That'll play through in the economics, because it's really hard to stop. As a local authority, it's really, really difficult to stop development in those areas. It's really, really hard, as Kapiti and down that coast found, when you try and put hazard lines on maps and lawyers get involved and how dare you put this on. So I think there's some enabling elements we need to do. In terms of Darren talked about before, we have, on a transport example, a rural community who's lost a big culvert a couple of times, and exactly the discussion he had is if we try and fight the big storms, when we lose control, it's hard to recover. But if we allow this to have shorter inconveniences more frequently, it'll cope with those over-design events better. And that's where they've landed it. And so that's ultimately been a cheaper solution. They'll be disrupted short times more frequently, but they should be able to withstand these bigger events with less significant outcomes. And whilst for Hastings, our wastewater treatment plant wasn't materially affected, the drainage system almost got to us because all the regional council's drainage pumps were off. We're doing exactly that thinking now when we've got major capital coming up, just rethinking some of our resilience planning, which parts of the plant may stay there for the long term, and therefore which ones are worthwhile that will need to be lifted and have additional compliance, and actually which parts we may need to have a consideration of moving out of harm's way. And so in our short-term and medium-term investment planning, so that will be an interesting conversation to have with the funders in the community around choices and implications, because there is no free lunch here.
Darren, did you have something you were wanting to jump in with then?
Yeah, I guess just picking up on Craig's point of awareness, and that's probably something that I've been acutely working with communities around engaging post-event. So I think we've got a lot of work to do around understanding risk and understanding, the level of service that you get from whether it's just the stormwater network that protects your community, or again, the road, and expecting that the road will be blocked X amount of times a year or over certain rain events. So for us, there's a real opportunity as well as anything, I think, to use an event like the cyclone to highlight risk. Because that's obviously one part of, you can build tangible, hard infrastructure, but there's a huge element of actually the community, because it's expectation management, I think, when it comes down to it, because you get, a lot of community, point finger, unfortunately, at local councils around their infrastructure is not up to spec or whatever it might be, but it's actually understanding and quantifying the risk that, and as I was alluding to with the work I've been doing in one of the communities in Hastings, in particular around their stormwater system, that systems were built in the 70s, 80s, after events, and they were set up to provide X level of service. And the work that we're doing to kind of protect the community is going to provide 1 in 100-year level of service, or for X amount of rainfall or flow. But you have to realise that you're always going to, a Cyclone Gabrielle type event was never going to stand up to most of this infrastructure we built. We generally would never be able to afford to protect against an event of that magnitude. So how do we make community aware of that our infrastructure is only able to cope to so much? There might be parts of the network that stand up, but again, we focus on our ability to recover. And I think there's a big conversation to have around awareness.
I think, though, there's also, as a sector, it's around, yes, we can design to a limit, whether it's 1 in 100, 1 in 50, 1 in 500, but also as a sector around doing the thinking around how do we lose control. It is a controlled fashion as much as possible. And so it's designing for the over-design, so we have some understanding of what loss of control means. And I guess that was from the Hiratonga Plains part of Hawke's Bay, and from Central Hawke's Bay side, where there were flood control systems in place. They worked perfectly to design, but when they lost control, they really lost control. And I think that's something to reflect on as a sector. In drinking water treatment, we've gone through, we have multiple barriers, so you've got checks and balances, so you know what happens. So I think it's thinking wider with urban stormwater, with flood control, and even wastewater. Like, when we lose control, do we know other scenarios of loss of control, and what can we do to best manage and communicate those? So we're having a conversation internally around how we'll communicate if we lost our wastewater treatment plant. And there are plans, they're pretty ugly, but our community aren't fully aware of them. So I think as a sector working through in the design phase and communication is, what does loss of control look like, and can we influence it, or is it going to be a random event?
I mean, that's a huge amount of information and incredible insights that you guys have shared with us over the last half an hour. I think we've covered everything from relationships and the importance of trust, especially in that early response stage, and building those relationships longer term with the communities. We've talked about that an early response needing that stability and holding pattern so you can make the right choices in the longer term. And then there's a fair amount there, both Craig and Darren, that you've talked about in terms of how we need to think slightly differently about those responses, and being adaptive to the fact that we can't protect against absolutely everything. I'm not sure you can summarize it all in that much of a nutshell, but it feels like there was a huge amount in there that we can definitely take away.
Kia ora, Craig and Darren. I feel like I've been on that journey with you almost over the last 18 months. Fascinating insights, and I'm sure a lot of people will enjoy hearing about that, and will take a lot from it. So thanks for joining Hannah and myself today, and thank you to everyone listening to this latest episode. We're back next month with our next podcast. We've got plans for a couple of podcasts coming up, so potentially some reflections from the water conference earlier in September, and hopefully an introduction to economic regulation. So look out for those. Thank you.